Hey everybody, and welcome to week 20 in our Stregoneria 101 course. This week's topic is Stregoneria and Giustizia Sociale, and so that is Stregoneria and social justice. Now, there are multiple parts or multiple components to understanding how social justice plays a part in witchcraft in the Italian tradition. Again, this comes back to remembering our ancestors and understanding their stories. It sort of revolves around understanding that persecution changes form, but it seldom changes motivation. And then we're going to cover things like activism in the craft and folk magic and activism and mysticism and activism and how those combined make up the social justice piece to Stregoneria. So let's dive into understanding and remembering the ancestors' stories. As we get started, it's important to understand that ours is a worldview that's always brought together the endeavors to fight injustice and oppression with the practice of our craft. We use this ability to shift energy, to create changes in our world in order to create a more just and a more peaceful and a more compassionate world, a more compassionate experience. Now, oppression in Italy can be traced, probably further back than the Roman Empire, but at least to the Roman Empire, which attempted to invalidate the traditions of the Afro-Siculo and Napolitan people, as well as the traditions of the Celtic, Germanic, and African-influenced Etruscan people in the north. The Roman Church joined the oppressors in the 4th century of the Common Era onward, and so we know many of these stories. We know the stories of oppression, but we don't always fully understand the roles that many of our ancestors played in fighting that oppression. And that oppression takes many forms. Women were oppressed, even within our own societies. Medicine was oppressed, and the understanding of science in its most natural forms, not just during the Trump administration, but even historically. Superstition resulted in the deaths and accusations of witchcraft against people who may or may not have been practitioners. Gender nonconforming people were oppressed, darker skinned people, the poor, intelligence and wisdom itself were often oppressed throughout our history. And then as we followed our ancestors into the New World, Congress envisioned a white, Protestant, culturally homogenous America when it declared in 1790 that, quote, only free white persons who have or shall migrate to the United States, unquote, were eligible to become naturalized citizens. So the calculus of racism underwent swift revision when waves of culturally diverse immigrants from the far corners of Europe, like the Romani people and the Italians and Sicilians, began to, and the Basque folks began to change the face of the United States. We've talked in previous classes about how in a period of a couple generations, we saw the lightening of the skin magically by I don't use that term lightly, but we saw the lightening of our ancestors' skin so that they would fit in. And here's why. We don't often talk about this story, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about U.S. history, especially in one of the most magical places in the United States. And no, it's not Salem. Now, while most lynching in our history was committed against black and brown people, the most grisly lynching in New Orleans occurred in 1891 on March 14th, and it was committed against a group of Siciliani, of Sicilian people. Hundreds of Sicilians were rounded up and beaten. 11 of them were hanged en masse, and decades of violence against Italians began in the Big Easy. Now, today, the 1891 lynchings in New Orleans are a reminder of how quickly anti-immigrant rhetoric can turn deadly, as we've seen in recent years, even in a city that now proudly celebrates its Italian heritage. And so one of the most horrific lynchings that took place against our people, took place in an area that we think of as one of the most magical, centers in the United States today. And so this fight against oppression is truly and absolutely part of our DNA. And throughout history, we could see other examples of oppression that our people were involved in fighting. The Medici and the papacy relied heavily on our practices to protect themselves and in some cases to destroy their perceived foes. Resistors were often led by wise men and wise women who lived outside the village. Seers in Pompeii and Ercolano played a role in people escaping the disaster when Mount Vesuvius erupted. The battle between the Benedante and the Melendante was a case of classic diversion tactics, which we'll talk about toward the end of this course and in another course by itself. Civil rights warriors were relied on people who were cunning folk. LGBTQ rights pioneers included a number of cunning folk, people like Dr. Leo Martello, for example. Women's rights pioneers, Black Lives Matter and resistance movement pioneers. Our people, the Streghe, have been involved throughout history at times when society needed resistance, when we needed to create that shift. And you need only look at some of the things that we've seen happen and play out in the last year to know that. So, excuse me, I said in the beginning that the root cause of persecution generally remains the same. So we need to understand that persecutions can change form, they can change target, but they always involve the delusion of control, power, and superiority. And there's a reason that I'm telling you that. There's a reason that I chose to make this a class, a module by itself, because our ancestors understood that power can't be taken. It can only be given freely. We work with energy to eliminate the bondage that comes from controlling people. And that's why it's so important that we do the work that we do the way that we've done it historically, because that's part of taking back our power and eliminating the bondage that comes from controlling people. And this is put a pin in that, because this is going to be an important point. See, we use our practice of the craft to shift energy around people and circumstances and events. I've told you many times throughout this course that that's really all we do. We do what we can to impress the will of justice upon the courts to ensure that justice is carried out. And we ensure that women remain at the center of our practice to ultimately reverse the oppression that comes with patriarchy. So we are at our core a non-patriarchal society, a non-patriarchal way of life or philosophy, and we use our voices to ensure that all spiritual traditions are given an equal voice in an oppressive society. Now, what do we do when justice systems fail, when people let us down, when all of the things that we hope we can shift don't turn out the way that we want? Well, when a justice system fails, we have at our disposal an arsenal of effective measures that are about bringing about the changes that we seek. Our magic can be used to do what activism might take longer to accomplish, and so that's where spell work comes into play. We can use our magic, our folk magic, to protect activists, to lift up the fair, and to eliminate that which brings harm to others. And that also goes directly to the work that we do with our ancestors, because some of our ancestors will have been, especially the ancestors of the last 50 to 100 years, may have been on the wrong side of history. And so when justice fails, we have at our disposal the means to create a shift and to restore justice. And part of that can be the ancestral work that we do. Now, that doesn't mean, as I've said in the module on working with our ancestors, it doesn't mean that you have to work with the ancestors who are assholes. It doesn't mean you have to work with an ancestor who may have abused you or abused somebody that you love. But it means that we work with the greater body of ancestors so that those, and you can very simply say, I do not wish to work with so-and-so, and so I bind him from contacting me. I bind him to do no harm to me or to anyone else. And I ask that the body of ancestors, the corpus of ancestors, will support me and help to protect him or her from doing harm to others, and help all of us to resolve that debt that's been incurred by their behavior. So as mystics, we live in harmony with the cosmos. And as such, we work with the phenomenal and the liminal worlds. And that's why it's so important that we, as I've said, especially in some of the most recent modules, that we forge alliances with the spirits of the earth, with the spirits of the elementals and the worlds unseen. And so particularly for those who are called to a mystical path, our responsibilities include teaching and protecting the practitioners of our way. And that also includes doing the work to heal the ancestors. Now, some of us may not be called to do that intense of a work, or some of us may not spiritually be at a place in our personal spiritual growth that we're ready for that. And that's also okay. So sometimes the work that we're doing, the place where we are right now, is about a lighter form of mysticism, coming to terms with who we are, reclaiming our own power. So don't feel like you have to jump right in to that deep mysticism that's teaching and that's protecting other people when you've not learned how to do that for yourself. And so other times you're ready. And so part of your path might be using synchronization, for example, to be able to hide our practices in plain sight, understanding and teaching philosophy and some of the more subtle practices that we'll be teaching in some of our advanced classes. And we use our contemplative lives as a means of serving the cosmos and alleviating suffering without the strictures of superstition and religion. But it's important to understand that all of these things, the craft, using the mental portion of the craft, the folk magic portion of the craft, the mystical portion of the craft, all of that is a framework that allows us to find the place where we are and where we are right now. And so social justice is as much about restoring justice in our own lives, restoring that balance in our own lives, as it is about alleviating the suffering in others. Because we can't really alleviate another person's suffering until we're fully in our power, and until we fully reclaim that power, until we fully recognize the potential that we have to be who we really are, not who anybody else expects us to be. So some examples of these three aspects of social justice in Italian witchcraft can be found in things like Magic for the Resistance, the Inner Alchemy movement, social justice warrior witchcraft, which you can find on Facebook, African traditional religions and movements, the Contemplative Order of Compassion. These are just some examples of ways in which we can express who we are as we come into these last 7 weeks of the course. It's really about, we're going to go into a little more intensive spell work and protection work. We're going to talk a little bit more about activating our DNA and doing some really intensive healing. But all of this is really about taking what you've learned in the first 20 weeks and beginning to embody it in a way that's authentically yours, that's authentically got your fingerprint on it. And so this week we do have homework. Now, as I said on our live discussion for week 19, I'm not going to call on anyone. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. But I would like you to consider ways in which this course may have inspired you to become more involved in your local community to alleviate suffering, or in your family to alleviate suffering. Maybe to become more involved on a bigger stage, to do the same thing, to become a social justice warrior in some way. Does the work of activism speak to you at all? Or does it call you? Do you feel like when you were listening to this last 15-20 minutes of explanation of social justice and witchcraft, is that something that you feel a little bit excited and maybe even a little bit scared of doing? Like, did it just kind of like strike a nerve and make you a little excited and a little bit uneasy? Or is it something that you don't really feel is part of your path, or it's not where you are right now? I don't want you to feel like you have to answer that in the class, but I really want you to answer that yourself. And so now, hopefully, you understand why we don't avoid ancestral work or engage only in the superficial practice of pop culture witchcraft, because in order to truly be about the work of social justice, we have to really heal ourselves. And so we have to recognize that our DNA is imprinted with the suffering that may or may not have caused some of our ancestors to make decisions that weren't always great decisions, to sometimes be on the wrong side of history, to sometimes be the oppressed, and to be hurt and wounded and traumatized. And so we bring that trauma in our own DNA. And so if we avoid ancestral work, then we avoid the opportunity to heal ourselves, to really begin to turn that page and kind of pay that forward for the next generation, so that they don't have that imprint to have to deal with. So I want you, those are really big questions, and I want you to take some time with that this week. I apologize. I really thought I was going to be able to get this module done in about 10 minutes. I know that we're beyond 15 now. But I wanted to keep this short because I really want you to do that work, and that's going to make more sense in our next module, when we start talking about those people and energies and places that take advantage of our weaknesses, take advantage of our vulnerabilities. So spend some time this week really thinking about that, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys on the other side in our live discussion.